Okay, we're at 1 minute past the hour, so I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. Today we're talking about DevOps Config. My name is Joe Offenberg. I'm an outbound product manager in our DevOps business unit. I've been with ServiceNow about 3 years. I came over with the acquisition of a company called Sweagle. And what Sweagle did was we had a config data management platform that was then acquired by ServiceNow and re-platformed into ServiceNow. So when I say config data management, I'll go through the scope of it, so you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm going to bring up another slide here, so we can go through the scope of DevOps of config data. Okay. So when we talk about config data, we mean, often it's data related to applications that's becoming more complex, such as microservices. And these are the config settings for how the microservices might connect to a database or might connect to another microservice. Often these include secrets like API keys and passwords, or things like feature toggles, install paths, database connections, heap size. There's also release-related config data. So from one release to a next, you might have different dependencies. You might find these type of settings in an XML file, like a pom.xml. When you build your application, you have certain settings there. And then, of course, as you deploy and you run it through testing in different environments, you're going to have different settings in different environments, right? So you'll have maybe a database connection string in your test environment that's different than your staging environment. And of course, hopefully it's different than in your production environment, right? And then of course, today with infrastructure as code, folks using tools like Terraform, Kubernetes, CloudFormation templates, Google Cloud Platform, and all of the infrastructure as code has its own set of settings, and this is declarative config data, so it can be quite quite a volume of config settings, and that that'll make up the bulk of actually most of your config settings. And it doesn't have to be infrastructure as code. It could be static infrastructure. It could be resources that get provisioned in the cloud. All of that is fair game for this DevOps config platform. Okay. And what we do is we look at the data from different angles, right? So when you define that infrastructure in the cloud, for example, you might have different settings and what you might call tokens or variables in those config files. When you deploy it, those values are going to get filled in by environmental settings. So the defined state is going to be different than the deployed state, right? Of course, after it's been running for a while, you might have the discovered state, right? So you're going to go and see, okay, what are the settings now? Did they drift from the original baseline? Okay. And then, of course, having the history of all those settings over time is really useful. So we want to be able to, make sure that the changes that have taken place, one, they're attached to a change record, but also we can go back in time and see what were the changes 2 weeks ago, what were the changes 2 months ago or 6 months ago. So being able to take snapshots of those changes are really valuable. So we have various states of config data, but then for various reasons, the amount of config data is growing. Okay, so some apps might only have tens of thousands of what we call config data items. A config data item is essentially just a key value pair, one setting, right? It's the Java heap size is this value, right? So that's a CDI. Other applications might have hundreds of thousands. And then, of course, as the applications become more complex and they involve multiple environments with multiple application services and different ways of provisioning them in different geographies and so on, you could have millions of config settings, right? So how do we keep track of it all? And what do we do for making sure that it's valid before we deploy it to production? Okay, so let me explain how we're going to do this and how it works. So various sources of config data exist in your environment, and this is one of the problems we were trying to solve because, back about 10, 12 years ago, I was with the team of Sweagle before Sweagle was invented, and we were doing release automation. And we'd go to a customer and we would say, hey, we need to help, release your deployments, but we need to understand the config settings. And often the config values were basically in 10 or 15 different places for all the different components of an application. Some of them were in the file system, some of them were on a SharePoint or an Excel file, some of them were in a database, some of them, and more recently we started seeing them in Git repositories. So we needed to basically have a way to collect all this config data from all the various locations, okay, and then bring that into a model that then we could use to track that config data, right? Once we had it in the model, we can start applying things like role-based access control to it. We could start applying validation rules to it, okay, and continuously validate it as it was changing. And that was extremely valuable. And then, of course, having all of this config data in the model allowed us to then create some really nice, basically some really nice exporters. So we could generate config data, basically generate config data from the model on the fly. And then, of course, having all of that data in the platform, now in ServiceNow, is going to allow us to apply some AI to it and some root cause analysis, and also just assisting humans in predicting what kind of changes lead to bad outcomes, for example, right? Because, as things start accumulating over time, we can start tracking, hey, whenever certain settings get deployed, we see an increase in incidents. We see an increase in outages, or the monitoring tools start telling us that performance is starting to degrade, right? So having this data feedback loop based on changes to config setting is a really powerful use case for AI. So that's something that's stay tuned, right? That's to come. Okay. So what I'll do now is I will talk a little bit about the adoption journey, and what we want to do is understand that you don't have to deploy this all at once. There are various use cases that I'm going to take you through, and then help you get started with just let's say tracking of the configuration data. Okay, so if we focus just on tracking, I think you'll get a lot of value out of it very quickly, and you'll be able to implement this very quickly. Okay, so what I mean by tracking is we capture the changes to the config settings, and often these are going to be in like a YAML file or a JSON file or an XML file. That file is going to be part of your Git repo, and you'll have pipelines running against that repo that like build and test the application and eventually deploy the application. So anytime it changes, we're able to capture that data in flight. Okay. Now, validating it is extremely valuable as well, because if something is invalid, we'd want to know it. We want to actually stop that pipeline to prevent bad config settings from being deployed to production, right? So if somebody, and often there are a lot of use cases around keeping development settings from leaking into production. I'll give you some examples. Developers like to turn debug on, right? Because they get a lot of information about how the application is running in the development environment. However, if you leave debug turned on in production, you're going to take a huge performance hit, right? You're going to have a huge problem with performance. So we want to make sure that debug is turned off. Another example, developers like to turn off certificate validation. Why? Because developers have a hard time getting valid certificates for their development environment. They provision a new environment, and now they need to request an SSL certificate. Sometimes it could take a few days. So they simply turn off the validation of that certificate, meaning the applications will talk to each other without concern for whether it's talking to the actual server because it's not validating the SSL certificate. So they'll leave that setting turned on. And that's a real example that happens all the time in production environments. And now the production environment is exposed to, basically a vulnerability that would allow another instance or somebody to spoof a connection to that application, right? So that's the type of thing we want to validate. But also we could take it up to a higher level, to like a governance level. For example, I'm going to show you an example of GDPR. This is the European privacy regulations, right? And there are a lot of IT settings involved in compliance with those European privacy laws. And one example is, we want to make sure if you have European customer data in a database, you want to make sure you're not provisioning that database outside the EU, right? Because that would violate the law. So what we can do is we can ensure, because ServiceNow has the information about the compliance rule in IRM, we have attributes about the application, whether it's a regulated app, whether it's a customer-facing app, whether it's the geography of that app, where it's located. These are CMDB attributes we have. We can actually validate whether it's in compliance, right? Because now we have the actual setting in the CloudFormation template, in the Terraform file of wherever you're trying to provision that database, we can validate that. So that's an example of a higher level validation capability, okay? So we'll start off with tracking today. Validation could come at a later date, but just get the data into the data model and start taking snapshots of it, and that will be extremely valuable as well, and I'll show you why. And then management of this config data, okay, is very important, because once you start centralizing it, it starts making sense to actually use the data you have to generate the files that are necessary. Meaning we have the power, and it's a very powerful hierarchical data model. We have the power to utilize the information we have in the CMDB, other data you have in the data model, to actually generate config settings, okay? So proactively create the config files so that you wouldn't even have to ensure validation. Basically, you're generating them from the system itself. And once you do that, you've reached the point of management, config data management, okay? Now that takes a little bit of effort. That also takes, in some ways, a culture shift, because everybody likes to manage their own config files and store them in the Git repo. But it is very compelling, and if you can convince your development teams to utilize this, and we're working very hard to make it easy for them to do that, then it becomes a very powerful solution for making sure that config settings are valid in the production environment, even right when they're created, okay? And then, of course, what I was talking about a few minutes ago, leveraging AI-generated config settings and validation policies based on this continuous observation of what's happening in production. Basically, that feedback loop that's such an important part of DevOps, and have that have that feedback into future config settings, okay? So that's it. I'm going to take you now into a demonstration of the product, and I'm going to start here with the pipeline. Okay, so right now you're looking at a Jenkins pipeline, and you might have seen this same pipeline if you're familiar with DevOps change velocity. Okay, it's a pipeline that we use to build an application, run some testing on it, run some validation on it, run some functional testing, and then eventually create a change record, as you see here, right? And what we have in that change record is all of the results of all the testing and building and validation that took place just to ensure compliance with the change approval policies. But what we're focused on today is DevOps Config. So what I'm going to show you is what we also have, and let me open up another instance here. What we also have, and I'll bring up that change record, is a snapshot of the config settings, okay? And why is that snapshot important? Well, I'll show you. Let me show you, let me get this out of the way. this is my Git repo. These are settings I changed, right? And I mean, these are basically the CloudFormation template. These are all the settings for provisioning my application in the cloud. And as you can see, this one particular application, it's essentially the front end of a web-based customer-facing application, has hundreds of lines of configuration data, right? So what we do is part of this Jenkins pipeline is we upload that file every single time the pipeline runs. And then if it changes the data model, that means if you had new settings in there, we are going to create a snapshot, and then we're going to validate that snapshot, okay? But more importantly is we're going to attach that snapshot that you see here. If it's valid, we are going to attach that snapshot to our change record, okay? So the change record has lots of information here. It has the work items from Jira. It has all the commits from Git. It has all my test results. All of these are capabilities that you can learn about in DevOps change velocity. But for our purposes today, what I'm showing you is we have the snapshot, okay? And from here, I could actually drill into that snapshot. So show me the config data. And let's see what it looks like in DevOps config, okay? So the config data, like I said earlier, is a hierarchical model of all of the config settings as they relate to this application. Now, this is a specific deployment of an application, so we only have a subset of the model. We have the production environment in the US, and then we have the CloudFormation template file I just saw you, and then automatically we build out all the different nodes of config data. And I could put this in a list view so you can see what we have are the actual settings and parameters for EC2 instances, Lambdas, RDS DBs, S3 buckets. Okay, so all of that data makes its way into the data model. And that's what you'll see is the subsets of that data. So it's very complex, and it has quite a bit of data. And, there might be some secrets here. We have ways of obfuscating the secrets, or we can encrypt the secrets at rest and, using the platform encryption capabilities. We have ways of deduplicating the data, right? So in the data model, if the same data shows up in 100 different places, but is only slightly different in those places, then we can actually use a symbolic link to the original data and have it override any settings, specifically in the US or specifically in a production environment and so on. So the data model itself is kind of the secret to the success of this product. It's why it works so well, is because of the way we model the data, okay? Now, let me show you another example of how we can use this. So I'm gonna go into my workspace here. We'll go into the service operations workspace this time. Got a lot of workspaces in ServiceNow. And now I'm like an incident manager, right? Or someone in operations, and an alert comes in. And what happens when the alert comes in is basically ServiceNow does a really good job of trying to determine the root cause. So it'll know that the alert came in, and this could be from a tool like Lightstep, for observability in production, or it could be from any of the hundreds of other monitoring tools out there, like Datadog or something like that. And we get these alerts. And then what ServiceNow is going to do is look at all the recent changes to that service. And based on those changes, right, we could actually then look, that change record will have those config snapshots attached to it. And we could actually look at the actual, this is taking a minute to load. We can actually look at the config data in that snapshot, okay? So as an operator, I could very quickly see what the settings are. But the settings aren't gonna make sense to me, right? What's really important to me is what changed, right? Because that's gonna help me determine root cause. So I'm only gonna show me the differences of the settings. Some things might not be significant and some things might be significant. But if I look at only the differences, it'll help me determine root cause. But also, I could go back to other snapshots. I don't have to look at the two most recent snapshots. I could say, let's go back to January. Show me all the config data snapshots going back several months. I could then go to the list here and say, okay, show me the one from January 9th to the one in August. Because sometimes, a queue might slowly start filling up, or you might start running out of space in a segment, or you might have a performance issue that degrades over time. So you really want to get to the beginning of when that degradation happened, right? And the idea here is that you can compare any two snapshots in the history of that CI. Okay, so that's really valuable. Okay, I see we have a couple of questions. I'm going to pause for a minute and answer a couple of questions. The first question is, what is Lightstep? So Lightstep is a technology. It's basically a monitoring tool for observability, and it uses telemetry data from applications to measure performance and errors and things like that. And it's owned by ServiceNow, and you can use it for monitoring your application. So that's the example I like to use. But there's tons of other ones out there, like App Dynamics, for example, that do similar things. Okay, is service mapping required to have config data flow back to the app service? So if you want it to flow back to the app service, then yes, you do have to have, well, no, you don't have to have service mapping. You just have to have the services defined, okay? Because what we do is we link what we call a deployable in the config data model. And think of the config data model as adjacent to the CMDB. It's not really part of the CMDB, but we link it to the CMDB. It's adjacent to the CMDB. And this application, okay, and I'll show you what that looks like here. This deployable is going to be mapped to that application service. Okay, so if I click on Manage Deployables here, you'll see that particular deployable can be mapped to various application services. Okay, so this is Globex Prod. The dev environment might be mapped to different ones. It's mapped to a development version of the service, and so on. So that's the link right there. That's the link between the deployable at the top of the config data model I showed you, and also the application service. So you don't need service mapping, but you do need application services defined. I hope that answered the question. Okay. Any other questions before I move on? Okay. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to, make a change to this config data, and I'm going to, as I was explaining, I'm going to deploy this back. I'm going to try to deploy this database in a different region, US East 1. I'm going to go ahead and commit that change, and I'm going to now go ahead and then run another Jenkins job here. And what you'll see is this time, when it runs, it's going to fail. And if it doesn't do it in a timely manner, I'll show you one of the older ones. But in the meantime, let me show you the connection between the config validation and the IRM solution. So we want to go into the compliance workspace here. And what you have in compliance, if you're not familiar with it, you have basically these authority documents, which are like rules like ISO 27000, COBIT, GDPR, and all these regulations that you might be under because of the industry you're in. If you're a financial company or if you're an insurance company, you'll have these regulations. And then under that, you'll have control objectives, okay? Control objectives roll up to those higher level authority documents. And then within the control objectives, you might have something like maintain GDPR, right? So in maintain GDPR, now underneath that control objective, you're going to have a whole bunch of controls. And most of these controls, I would say, most of the time, a lot of them are not automated, right? A lot of them are like attestations where a developer or some IT person actually gets an email, they check a box, and it basically says, no, Did you run the security scan? Yes, I did. You checked the box and you attested to the fact that you did it. Did you set, are all your websites using, 256-bit encryption on your certificates? And so they attest to the controls. But what we have now is the ability to map these config validation policies, right? And the policies, like validating the region of that AWS setting, is definitely a control to maintain GDPR compliance. So what happens now when that pipeline runs and reaches a point, this one's waiting for a queue. That means there's too much running here. Let me show you a previous one here, like this one. When it reaches a point where something fails, nope, not that one. Let me cancel one and we can get this one to run correctly. When it reaches the point where something is validated, then it's going to say, hey, this particular snapshot is invalid, okay? And it's invalid because, you have various policies on it. And what those policies mean is anytime a new snapshot is created, we have to validate the policies, okay? So when you have snapshots, you'll see some of them failed validation, some of them passed validation. If we look at one that failed, and this was a previous run, you can see all the validation results, meaning all the rules. Certificates were valid. There's no FTP settings. There's no HTTP settings. We want to make sure that all the URLs that connect use HTTPS instead of HTTP. We want to make sure that multiple availability zones are configured, so on and so forth. Sometimes you want to make sure that there are no duplicate keys, right? That sometimes that you might have two of the same exact config settings. So this is how this works. You get these rules that run against the snapshot. In this case, this one failed because we tried to use US East in the pipeline, okay? And US East isn't allowed because of the GDPR compliance. All the databases have to be deployed in EU regions because they contain European customer data. So this is how we enforce that in the Jenkins pipeline. And what we call this is shifting compliance left, okay? So we're shifting compliance left. We're discovering things happening in the earlier environments that are out of compliance. And this is why we can keep bad settings and focus on keeping that out of production. Okay, so that's what DevOps Config is all about. There we go. We have our failed validation, and if I look at the test results, and what's great is we report this back in the pipeline, right? If you're using a Jenkins pipeline, if you're using an ADO pipeline, if you're using GitHub Actions, you'll see the results of the validation. It says US East for AW key region is not compliant. So right away, the developer knows why the pipeline failed. And they could do two things, right? They can fix it here, okay? But there's also, if you're familiar with IRM, anytime something fails, you do have the ability to request an exception. So somebody on the DevOps side can say, okay, we just need this to work for a short period of time, request an exception, and then that will allow the pipeline to continue, but with an exception, okay? It won't fail. So you can either fix it or request an exception. The exception will kick off a workflow in IRM to have somebody approve it, okay? Okay, so that's what DevOps Config is all about, tracking and validating config data. And I think before we go into how do you get started with this, I'm going to take a couple of more questions here. Okay, to get started, what plugins are needed? Well, I'm going to show you exactly which plugins you need in just a minute, so hold tight there. And the second question is also, do we have to activate a plugin to have DevOps Config applications activate an instance? Yes. So I'm going to show you exactly. Those are good questions right now because that's what I need to transition to. Okay, so plugins. Let's talk about the plugins you need. Okay. there's two main products in the DevOps BU for ServiceNow. There's DevOps Change Velocity, and then there's DevOps Config. Okay, DevOps. If you do a search on DevOps Change Velocity is not really a prerequisite, but I would recommend installing it because it gives you the ability to register the plugins that you need in the pipelines. Okay, so you need to install plugins on the ServiceNow side, but you also need to install plugins in the orchestrators. Okay, so and DevOps Change gives you all of the settings and everything for that. So you should install, if you're going to use the plugins, I do recommend installing Change Velocity. You don't have to implement it per se. You just need the tables to recognize the plugins in the pipelines. Okay, so DevOps Change Velocity is one thing, and then DevOps Config. Now, I would recommend using these green bundled installs because each one has a bunch of apps that will install. Same thing with DevOps Config. Install this green bundle, and you'll see there's like 7 apps underneath it. And the current versions that are available are here, 2.3, and DevOps Config is there as well. So all of this gets installed when you install the bundle. So that's what gets installed on the ServiceNow side. I should point out there's a new component called Policy as Code Engine. When we run the policies, okay, and let me show you what I mean by that. If I click on one of these policies, the actual policy uses JavaScripting, and let me go into the DevOps config workspace and I'll show you what a policy looks like. The policy is actually written in JavaScript. So we give you a bunch of them out of the box, right? Like, it's 40 or 50 of them now, I see here. And what you can do is you can create your own. And it takes a little bit of JavaScripting knowledge, or you can actually Google a lot of things you can do in JavaScript, but it's a very powerful language. And if you've been doing anything in ServiceNow, you're probably doing some JavaScripting anyway. But the policy are all written in JavaScript, and this is what the policies look like. And there are different versions of them, as you can see here. So that is the policy as code engine. And there are several other modules at ServiceNow taking advantage of policy as code. So, you've seen policies in a lot of different ways in ServiceNow. The trend in the industry is to move towards policy as code because of flexibility and basically a lot of the things that are going on in DevOps, the agility of it. And then you can do that now with ServiceNow. Okay, so those are really the only 2 plugins you need: DevOps Config and DevOps Change Velocity. Now there are, and then you have the policy content that's included. Okay, that'll give you policies. We didn't really talk too much about the exporters, but the exporters are also written in JavaScript. Okay, and so those are the. So I hope I answered the questions about the plugins. Any more questions? Okay, how is the Jenkins pipeline invoked with the config data from ServiceNow? Okay, typically pipelines are not invoked by ServiceNow, right? Pipelines run when things change in the repos, okay? So often you'll have what's called continuous deployment, meaning anytime you make any commit to a file in a repo, it'll trigger a pipeline run. And if the pipeline makes it all the way to production, you'll get a change record. And if the change record is automatically approved, it'll get deployed. Okay, so pipelines are triggered by activity happening in the pipelines. Okay, so we're not doing any triggering from ServiceNow. What we're doing is we're capturing all of the results that took place in the pipeline: the testing, the scanning, the security scans, and of course the config data that you see right here. Okay, so that's essentially how it works. Most pipelines never make it to production, so you wouldn't want to have to go through ServiceNow to trigger pipelines. They're just part of the agile development process now, that pipelines are running all the time. Sometimes a pipeline, if the build takes a long time, the pipeline will run like once at the end of the day. So all the developers will check in their code, and then the pipeline will run, at the end of the day at 6 o'clock, and go ahead and create a build and test and deploy it. Okay. Okay. What's the OCM for turning this on and making it mandatory for policy compliance? Well, so I think the what makes it mandatory for policy compliance is the integration with change management, because if you already have change velocity in place, that means they can't get the production deployment until this change is approved, right? So if I go in here and I go into that change record, I actually have to approve the change for it to, or it's automatically approved for that change to get into production. And what you can do is you can enforce the that the config data is valid, that it passed validation. You see here, that could be one of your one of the criteria for your approval policy, right? So that's one way to enforce and make it mandatory. And developers generally like to have their things deployed to production quickly. So, they're more than happy to upload the data in their pipeline and make sure that it's compliant if they want to get through the change approval process. And of course, we've added change approval automation to ServiceNow using the change approval policies, so that, this could take even a minute, less than a minute, for this change to get approved. In this case, we didn't meet the criteria for an automatic improvement, so I got to override that. I'm going to move this to the implementation stage, and then that will allow this Jenkins pipeline to deploy to production. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, I don't see any other questions here, so I am going to go ahead and let's talk about the next step on how do we get started here? How do we get going with this? So let me bring up, this is basically the steps. Okay, so we are install the necessary plugins. We just covered that. And what I'm going to do now is show you that the next step is basically to create an application and a deployable, right? So what that means is in DevOps Config, we are going to, okay, this is deploying now because the change was approved by me, you see, and that gets recorded in the pipeline. Just wanted to show you how that works if you haven't seen that before. Okay, so back to DevOps Config. What we have are applications that are, and this we covered earlier, these applications are mapped to deployables underneath, and then those deployables are mapped to application services, right? So if I wanted to create a new one, and let's say I have a new application with a new pipeline that I want to upload data from, I'm going to go ahead and say, okay, let's call this GSW1 for Getting Started Workshop, and I'm going to go in and create it. Now I can create the application. I can use an existing application model or an application service, and it'll allow me to select that service from here, okay, from the list, right? No, there's none found here. Okay, application model, and then I can basically use, let's say, the portfolio model and create that. So now I have the application created, and we're going to now create some deployables. Now remember, a deployable usually represents an environment. So I'm going to create, I'm not in the right application here. I'm going to create, let me go back to that new one I just created and bring up that one. And so the deployable can really represent anything, but best practice would have it represent, well, let's go with the corp site, would have it represent an application and environment, right? So this will be the development environment for corp site. I could go ahead and create another one. Let's call it the test environment for corp site, and this will track the config settings in that environment. And now let's create one for the production environment, okay? And the production environment is usually where we're going to apply some validation rules. Okay, so now we have basically the schema in the config data model where I can now upload data to these deployables and map them to the deployables. Okay. So once you have this in place, the next step is to, okay, let's identify the source of config data. And since we're talking about DevOps and DevOps pipelines, the source of the config data is usually going to be some type of Git repo. Okay, so in this one, I have an infrastructure folder. I have various, there's some Kubernetes Helm charts in here. There's there's a MongoDB config data here in JSON. I have some YAML files. I have some XML files. And so there's various types of config data I can pull from. And what I've done in my Jenkins pipeline, right? And let me show you what that looks like, is we add a directive to the pipeline. So this is what your DevOps people will have to do, is once you install the plugin in Jenkins, and let me show you in Jenkins what that looks like. Jenkins has plugins just like ServiceNow has plugins. So if you go to the plugin manager in Jenkins, and it's the same thing in ADO, and you search for ServiceNow, you'll see ServiceNow DevOps, okay? If you're doing ADO, same idea. You'll see in the extensions, you will see in the organization settings, extensions, you will see the ServiceNow DevOps extension, right? So that's and you just want to make sure you have the latest version of that extension, and that'll make sure that when you call the directive, it'll have the extension behind it to know what to do. And when I say call the directive, what I mean is inside the pipeline file, if you're doing pipeline as code or if you're doing classic pipelines, you'll need a directive to first upload the config files. Now you can do this in a wildcard way. You can say, give me all the JSON files and recursively search all the directories, for example. Or you can say, give me a specific file, and it'll upload that. And that's really all you need to do to get to the first, that first step in that model is tracking the config data. All you need to do is basically upload the file, and every time it changes, we are going to snapshot it into ServiceNow. So what do you need to upload it? Well, you need the application name, right, which you just created. You need the plugin configured. So let me show you that. Once the plugin is installed, you're going to have to configure it. In the case of Jenkins, basically what that means is you have to give it a URL and some settings. The URL and there's an integration user you can use, or there's a token you can use, and you can set the plugin to use those settings. Just like anything else in Jenkins, it connects to tools. It's going to have settings here. There's the ServiceNow, and there's my URL, and these are the tool IDs. And then Jenkins has a way of storing the credentials in a secret, so you can just refer to the credential record. I'm using the DevOps integration user, for example. When you install the tool, you'll see it'll give you a sysID for the orchestration tool. You want to make sure you put that here. That'll help tie everything together. So now you have the plugin installed, and then in the Jenkins file, you'll have to refer to. It's going to know to use that connection to upload the data that you specify here. Okay. So that's that step. Any questions so far? No more questions? Okay, so this is all crystal clear. Okay, the next step is to add directives to your pipeline. That's what I just showed you, right? So if you're using Jenkins, I showed you. Let me show you in ServiceNow. It's something very similar. So I mean, in ADO, it's something very similar. You'll have a directive in the pipeline. Pipeline here. Let's show you what that directive looks like. You're going to want to upload the config data, right? It looks just like it does in Jenkins, basically the same inputs. Where are you uploading it? What type? In this case, I'm doing it in a wildcard way. So give me all the JSON files you can find in all the directories in the repo and upload them. When they get uploaded to ServiceNow, it'll build out the directory model as nodes in the config data model. So it's very neat. And then anytime something changes in those files, you're going to get a new snapshot. Okay, so those are the directives you need. So you create the application. In the directive, you're going to point to the application and point to where in the application you want to upload the data. And then for the last step, and this is an important step, if you want to do that use case that I showed you earlier, you want to register the config snapshot with a change record. This has a dependency on DevOps change velocity. Okay, unless you want to manually create change records, we do have API calls that you can use to do that. But DevOps change velocity already does that for you. It already creates the change record automatically. It's a very comprehensive change record with all the work items, commits, all the defects, all the security scans, and so on. Basically, in that same directive, okay, we're going to actually point it to the snapshot. Okay, so that's one of the inputs is the snapshot name that gets generated earlier in the pipeline. Okay, now if there are any, let's see, if there are any other questions about this, you can post them to the Q&A. But that's pretty much all you need to get started with the first use case of tracking the config data, okay? I did create a series of videos on YouTube. If you go to the ServiceNow YouTube page, you do a search for DevOps Config. Basically what I just showed you, how to do the tracking, and also I just released another one on validation, so that should help, okay? Okay, what's the question? The question is, what type of authentication do the plugins use? That's a good question. So the plugins use two types of authentication. There's an API token-based authentication, and then there's also a basic authentication where you store a user password in the tool, and then it can reference that as a record to make the API call using the user and password. So you have either one of those options, to use an API key or to use the basic authentication with a user and password. Okay, I hope that answers the question. All right, so I hope that was valuable. If there are no more questions, I think I'm going to wrap it up here, and I hope that was valuable. If you do have any more questions, you can find me at joe.offenberg@servicenow.com, and you can reach out to ServiceNow through your account team. And somebody's asking for the link to the video. Let me see if I can find that quickly and put that in the chat. Just bear with me 1 second. But yeah, that's that would be a good idea to have that in my slide deck, and I didn't have it. Let's see here. Okay, here's the video, and I put it in the chat. And it's called, if you got ITS, whoop, there it goes. If you have ITSM Pro, you own it. So basically, get started with DevOps Config. Oh, I didn't send it to everybody. Hold on, I got to send it to everybody. Okay, now you should have the link in the chat, but it's pretty easy to find with a Google search. That's basically how I found it. Yeah. All right, so I think we're going to wrap up here. Thank you, everybody, for joining the webinar, and go set up a sub-prod environment and start playing around with this stuff. It's pretty easy to get started, and if you need any help, you can reach out to me through your account team. Thank you.